She was his wife, but in the flickering candlelight of that grand dining room, she felt less substantial than the shadows dancing on the silk-covered walls. Evangeline, Duchess of Blackthorn, sat at the foot of the long mahogany table, her spine pressed against the carved oak chair as if she might disappear into it entirely. Her husband, Lucian Blackthorn, the Duke of Blackthorn, was seated far away at the head, his dark head inclined toward the woman on his right, Lady Rosalind Carrington, a widow newly returned to the county, with hair the color of spun gold and a laugh that tinkled like crystal glasses. The soup course had come and gone. Evangeline could not recall tasting it. All she could taste was the bitter copper of humiliation as she watched her husband's lips curve into a rare, gentle smile, a smile he had never once offered her in 3 years of marriage. The candle flames blurred. She pressed her napkin to her lap and willed her hands not to tremble. "How fortunate for the Duke," murmured Lady Pemberton to her left, behind the rim of her wine glass, "to have Lady Rosalind back in society. They were practically promised to each other once, before that unfortunate business with the late Viscount." "Indeed," came the whispered reply. "Everyone knows this marriage to Miss Sterling was merely a duty. So sad for her Grace. She tries so hard, poor thing." The words landed like tiny needles, each one drawing blood. Evangeline lifted her chin and stared at the centerpiece of hothouse roses, the petals a deep, bleeding crimson. She had arranged those flowers herself that morning, hopping to please him. He had not noticed. He had not looked at her once since the guests arrived. When Lady Rosalind placed her delicate fingers on Lucian's sleeve and leaned in to whisper something that made his expression soften, Evangeline felt something inside her crack, a small, clean break, like the first fracture in ice that would soon shatter a frozen lake. She had been holding her breath, she realized. She had been holding it for 3 years, and tonight she finally let it go. The pain did not burst out of her. It simply settled deep, a heavy stone where hope used to live. From that moment, Evangeline stopped reaching for a love that was never meant to be hers. The marriage had begun like a transaction conducted in fog. Evangeline Sterling, the only daughter of a baron whose name had been dragged through whispers of financial ruin, had been presented to the Duke of Blackthorn as part of a quiet arrangement between solicitors. Her grandfather had once saved the Blackthorn estate from a crippling debt decades ago, and the late Duke had sworn an oath of gratitude. When the Sterling family faced scandal and poverty, Lucian Blackthorn honored the oath with a cold proposal. He would save her family's land and secure her future, and she would become his duchess. The first time she saw him, he stood in her father's threadbare drawing room, silhouetted against the rain-streaked window, tall and impossibly handsome, with eyes the color of a winter sea. She had been 20 years old and secretly, foolishly, full of hope. She had seen a fairy tale in his quiet intensity. She had not understood that she was simply a debt being paid. On their wedding day, he had kissed her gloved hand and spoken the vows in a voice stripped of warmth. That night, he had escorted her to a lavish bedchamber in Blackthorn Castle and left her there alone, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like a judgment. In the 3 years that followed, he treated her with icy courtesy, providing her with gowns, jewels, and a title, but never his presence. He spent his days in his study, his evenings in his library, and his unguarded moments lost in memories of the woman he could not have. Evangeline had tried. How desperately she had tried. She learned the names of every tenant on the vast estate, memorized his favorite dishes, wore the colors he once mentioned liking. She waited at the window each evening for his horse to appear on the drive, her heart fluttering with pathetic anticipation. And each time he strode past her with a distracted nod. Each time he left her standing alone at a ball while he stared at the empty doorway as if waiting for someone else, another shard of her hope fell away. The night of the dinner party was simply the final piece. After the last guest departed and Lady Rosalind's carriage rolled into the darkness, Evangeline walked slowly up the grand staircase, her fingers trailing the cold marble balustrade. She entered her chamber, a beautiful, lonely prison of ivory silk and gilt mirrors, and stood before the looking glass. The woman staring back at her had eyes that were too bright, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile naturally, and a careful composure that was cracking at the edges. She unpinned her dark hair and let it fall, suddenly exhausted beyond tears. That night Evangeline made a silent vow. She would no longer wait. She would no longer twist herself into shapes that might please a man who refused to see her. From this moment her heart was her own. She would lock it away where no one, especially her husband, could ever wound it again. The first tender shoot of change arrived not with a grand gesture, but with a child's cough. A fortnight after the dinner, Evangeline was walking through the village of Blackthorn Hollow, her basket filled with herbal remedies she had prepared in the still room, when she heard a thin, barking sound from a cottage near the mill. The door stood ajar, and inside she found a small boy of perhaps 6 years, flushed with fever, gasping for breath while his mother wept helplessly. Evangeline did not hesitate. She shed her gloves, knelt in the dusty rushes, and soothed the child with gentle hands. She prepared a steam of eucalyptus and chamomile, instructed the mother on cool compresses, and stayed for 3 hours until the boy's breathing eased. When she finally walked back to the castle, her skirts were soiled and her hair escaped its pins, but her heart felt lighter than it had in months. She did not notice the figure standing in the shadow of the castle gatehouse. Lucien had been returning from inspecting the eastern fields when he saw her emerge from the cottage, her expression soft, her hands brushing the hair from her face. He paused, his horse stamping impatiently. He watched his wife, his invisible wife, smile wearily at the miller's daughter and press a small pouch of herbs into the girl's palm. Something unfamiliar twisted in his chest, a quiet ache he had no right to feel. That evening at dinner, he looked at her across the table. Truly looked. She was wearing a simple gown of dove gray, and her dark hair was swept up carelessly, tendrils curling at her temples. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes. He realized with a jolt that he could not remember the last time he had asked about her day. "You were in the village," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Evangeline glanced up startled. "Yes, the miller's son was ill. I saw you return. You were kind to them." She held his gaze for a moment, and he thought he saw a flicker of something, surprise perhaps or a guarded hope, before she lowered her lashes and resumed eating. Anyone would have done the same. "Not everyone would have stayed so long," he said quietly. She did not answer, and the silence that followed was heavy with words neither of them knew how to speak. Lucien wanted to ask if she was well, if she needed anything, if she ever felt lonely in this vast, echoing castle. But the questions lodged in his throat, tangled with his own stubborn pride and the ghost of a love he had clutched for far too long. So he said nothing, and Evangeline excused herself early, leaving him alone with the candles and the regrets. That night she did not wait by the window. Spring unfolded across the Blackthorn lands like a slow, green exhale. Evangeline threw herself into the estate with a fervor that surprised everyone, including herself. She organized a village school in a disused tithe barn, brought in a gentle young schoolmaster named Mr. Daniel Reed, and began teaching the children to read 3 afternoons a week. She visited the elderly and infirm, learned the names of every shepherd and dairymaid, and spent her evenings copying recipes for medicines into a leather-bound journal. With each passing day, she felt the frozen places inside her begin to thaw, not with romantic love, but with purpose. She was no longer the Duke's neglected wife. She was simply Evangeline, a woman who could soothe a fever and mend a torn coat and make a frightened child laugh. The tenants adored her. The servants spoke of her with genuine affection. And somewhere in the quiet center of her heart, she stopped aching for a husband who did not want her. Lucien noticed the change with a growing, gnawing unease. At first, it was small things. He found his breakfast taken alone because she had already left for the village. He walked past her sitting room and saw it empty, the embroidery hoop gathering dust. When they dined together, she was polite and pleasant, but her attention seemed to drift toward the window, toward the world outside that she had built without him. She no longer asked him about his day. She no longer lingered in the library hoping he might speak to her. One evening he entered the drawing room to find her reading by the fire, a soft smile playing on her lips. She was so absorbed in her book that she did not hear him approach. He stood in the doorway, watching the firelight paint her features in gold, and felt a strange, sharp loneliness pierce his chest. She was right there, mere feet away, and yet she felt 1,000 miles distant. "What are you reading?" he asked, his voice too loud in the quiet room. She looked up, her smile fading into polite neutrality. "A book of poetry. Mr. Reed lent it to me. He thought I might enjoy it." The name landed like a spark on dry tinder. Mr. Reed, the young, earnest schoolmaster with the kind eyes and the boyish laugh. Lucien had seen them together in the village, their heads bent over a slate, their laughter mingling. He had felt an unpleasant prickle then, but he had dismissed it as irrelevant. Now, hearing that man's name on his wife's lips, something darker and hotter stirred in his veins. "I was not aware you spent so much time with the schoolmaster," he said, his tone carefully controlled. Evangeline closed the book. "He assists me with the children. He is a good man." "I am certain he is," Lucien replied, the words clipped. "But you are the Duchess of Blackthorn. It is unseemly to borrow books from a village teacher." She rose from her chair, her posture regal, her eyes calm. "I see. Would you prefer I borrow books from Lady Rosalind? I hear she has an extensive library." The remark was soft, but it struck with the precision of a blade. Lucien's jaw tightened. "That is not what I meant." "Then perhaps you should leave me to my reading. It harms no one." She curtsied with perfect, cold courtesy and left the room, leaving him standing in the firelight with the sting of her words still hanging in the air. That night Lucien did not sleep. He paced his study, his mind a torment of images, his wife laughing with another man, accepting a book from his hands, sharing quiet conversations while he himself had spent years offering her nothing but silence. He had no right to feel jealous. He knew that. And yet the jealousy was there, a living, coiling thing, and it refused to be ignored. The turning point came during the Midsummer Fair, a tradition on the Blackthorn estate that drew tenants and gentry alike. Evangeline wore a gown of pale lavender, her hair dressed simply with fresh flowers, and when she moved through the crowds, she was received with genuine warmth. She judged the pie contest, laughed with the farmers' wives, and danced with the children around the maypole. Lucien watched from beneath the shade of an ancient oak, his arms crossed, his heart pounding with an emotion he could no longer deny. Then Mr. Reed stepped forward and bowed before Evangeline, extending his hand for a dance. She hesitated only a moment before accepting, and they moved into the pattern of the country reel, their steps light, their faces bright with shared enjoyment. The villagers clapped and cheered. Someone remarked loudly, "What a fine couple they make, so easy together." The words were innocent, but they cut through Lucien like a scythe. He saw the way Reed looked at her, with admiration, with tenderness, with everything Lucien had withheld. He saw the way his wife smiled, a free and unguarded smile he had never been the cause of, and something inside him shattered. It was not anger, not precisely. It was terror. The terrifying, irreversible realization that he was losing her, that he might have already lost her, and that it was entirely his own doing. He strode away before the dance ended, his hands clenched so tightly that his nails bit into his palms. Lady Rosalind intercepted him near the refreshment tent, her golden curls perfectly arranged, her lips curved in a knowing smile. "You look troubled, Your Grace. Is the noise of the fair too much, or is it the sight of your wife enjoying herself that disturbs you?" He turned a cold gaze on her. "I am simply weary, Lady Rosalind." She laughed, a brittle sound. "Weary of a wife who prefers the company of farmers and school teachers. I cannot imagine why. You have always deserved someone who understands your world, Lucien. Someone who belongs beside you, not below you." He stared at her, and for the first time in years he truly saw her, the sharp calculation beneath the charm, the petty cruelty she masked with beauty. This was the woman he had spent a decade believing he loved. This was the phantom he had allowed to haunt his marriage and poison his home. The realization made him feel physically ill. "Forgive me, Lady Rosalind," he said, his voice distant. "I find I am needed elsewhere." He left her standing open-mouthed among the fluttering ribbons of the tent, her power over him finally, irrevocably broken. He did not seek out Evangeline that afternoon. He did not know how. Instead, he rode to the far edge of the estate and stood at the cliff's edge, staring at the gray, churning sea below. He was a man of stone, everyone said. He had learned to bury his feelings so deep that even he could not find them. But now the feelings were forcing their way to the surface, and they were terrifying. Grief for the years he had wasted, shame for the coldness he had shown, and a desperate, aching love for a woman he had never truly allowed himself to know. He had been a coward. He had hidden behind duty and old wounds, afraid to risk his heart, and now he might be too late. In the days that followed, Evangeline felt a subtle shift in the air. Lucien appeared at breakfast, his eyes following her movements with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He asked her about the school, about her herbs, about her plans. He complimented the new blue ribbon in her hair, a gesture so unexpected that she nearly dropped her teacup. She accepted his words with careful gratitude, but her heart remained guarded. She had given too much of herself in the past only to be met with silence. She could not survive another cycle of hope and disappointment. One afternoon she found a small velvet box on her dressing table. Inside lay a sapphire pendant, the gem the exact deep blue of a twilight sky. A note in Lucien's hand read simply, "This belonged to my mother. I thought it would suit you." Evangeline stared at the pendant for a long time. It was beautiful. It was thoughtful. It was also terrifying because it felt like a test she did not know how to pass. She closed the box and placed it in a drawer, unsure what to feel. When Lucien saw her at dinner that evening, his gaze dropped to her bare throat. A shadow passed across his features, but he said nothing. The silence between them was no longer icy. It was fraught, charged with unspoken words and painful awareness. He was trying to reach her, she realized, and she was too afraid to stretch out her hand. The tension broke with a single, careless remark from Lady Rosalind. A week later, at a garden party hosted by a neighboring earl, Evangeline stood alone near the rose arbor, watching the other guests mingle. She did not feel lonely. She had grown accustomed to her own company, but Lady Rosalind glided toward her like a beautiful snake, a glass of lemonade in her gloved hand. "Your Grace," Rosalind said sweetly, "I must compliment you on how resourceful you are. Fashioning a life among the peasants must be so fulfilling when one's husband has so little use for one at home." Evangeline turned, and for the first time she felt no sting, no shame, only a quiet, steady pity. "Lady Rosalind, you mistake my choices for a consolation. I assure you they are not. I have found purpose and joy in this life. Can you say the same?" Rosalind's smile froze. Before she could reply, a deep voice cut through the garden air. "Lady Rosalind, I believe you are wanted in the card room." Lucien stood a few paces away, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He had heard everything. He stepped forward, positioning himself beside Evangeline, a wall of solid protection. "And I must ask you to remember that when you speak to the Duchess of Blackthorn, you speak to my wife. I will not tolerate any slight against her." Rosalind's cheeks flushed crimson. She dropped a hasty curtsy and retreated, her composure in tatters. Evangeline stared at her husband, stunned. In 3 years he had never publicly defended her. He had barely acknowledged her existence. And now he stood like a sentinel, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his eyes blazing with something she could not name. "Why?" she whispered. He turned to her, and the fire in his gaze softened into something fragile, something that looked almost like desperation. "Because it was the truth, and because I have been silent far too long. Will you walk with me?" They left the party and wandered through the formal gardens until they reached a secluded fountain, the water whispering over ancient stone. Lucien stopped and faced her. In the fading sunlight, he looked younger and deeply, profoundly tired. "I owe you an explanation," he began, his voice rough. "When I was young, I made a promise to Rosalind's dying brother. We were boys together, and I swore I would always protect her. Over time, I confused that promise with love. I clung to her memory because it was safe. It required nothing of me but distant loyalty. And you, Evangeline, I saw you once, years before our marriage, at a garden party in London. You wore a blue dress and you were laughing at something your friend said. You were so full of life, so beautiful, that I could not breathe. I told myself then that a woman like you could never belong to a cold, broken man like me. I buried that feeling so deep I forgot it was there." She listened, her heart hammering. His words did not immediately heal the wounds, but they pulled back a curtain she had never known existed. He continued, his voice cracking. "When the scandal broke and your family needed help, I seized the arrangement not out of duty alone but because some hidden part of me wanted you. But I was a coward. I kept you at a distance because I was afraid of being hurt, afraid you would see the emptiness in me and be repulsed. So I let you suffer in silence, believing I did not care. And it is the greatest shame of my life." He sank onto the stone edge of the fountain, his head bowed. "I have lost you, haven't I? I see it in your eyes. You don't wait for me anymore. You don't need me, and it is exactly what I deserve." Evangeline stood perfectly still, the water's murmur filling the space between them. A part of her wanted to fall to her knees and forgive him instantly, to wrap her arms around him and erase the distance. But the wiser, stronger part, the woman she had become, knew that healing could not be rushed. Trust had to be rebuilt, brick by brick. "I am not gone," she said softly, "but I am no longer the girl who waited at the window. I cannot simply open my heart again because you ask me to. You must show me, Lucien, not with jewels or words, but with consistency, with presence, with time." He lifted his head, his eyes wet. "Then I will show you, every day for the rest of my life if that is what it takes. I swear it." What followed was a slow, tentative dance of two people learning each other for the first time. Lucien did not overwhelm her with grand declarations. Instead, he began appearing at the village school, not to watch, but to help, carrying buckets of water, repairing a broken shutter. He sat beside her at dinner and asked about her day, truly listening. He gave her space when she needed it and warmth when she allowed it. And gradually, like ice melting in spring, Evangeline began to trust again. One rainy afternoon she fell ill. A fever she had caught from a tenant's child took hold, and by evening she was burning and shivering, her mind adrift on dark waters. For 2 days, Lucien did not leave her bedside. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths, held her trembling hand, and spoke to her in a low, desperate murmur. She heard fragments of his voice through the haze, pleading, confessing, promising. When she finally opened her eyes, weak but alive, she saw him slumped in the chair beside her, his clothes rumpled, his face etched with exhaustion and fear. "You stayed," she rasped. He jerked awake, his eyes red-rimmed. "Evangeline." He fell to his knees beside the bed and pressed her hand to his lips. "I thought I would lose you. I cannot lose you. I love you. I have loved you from the very beginning, and I was too proud and too broken to show it. Please, please get well. I will spend every moment making you feel loved if you will just stay." Tears slipped down her cheeks, not of sorrow but of release. The walls she had built around her heart trembled. "I am here," she whispered. "I am not leaving." It was not an instant repair, but it was a beginning. Autumn painted the blackthorn woods in shades of amber and gold. Evangeline walked through the garden, her shawl drawn close against the crisp air. Behind her, footsteps crunched on the gravel path. She did not turn, but she knew those steps now, the steady, reassuring rhythm of her husband's approach. Lucien fell into step beside her, and without a word he took her hand. His palm was warm, his grip gentle but firm. They walked in silence past the fatting roses and the old stone fountain, now stilled for the coming winter. "I spoke to the vicar today," he said quietly. "I told him I wanted to renew our vows, not because any duty demands it, but because I want to stand before God and everyone we know and declare that you are the choice of my heart, if you are willing." Evangeline stopped and looked up at him, her breath misting in the cold air. The man standing before her was not the cold duke she had married. He was a man who had faced his own darkness, who had stumbled and fallen, and who had chosen to rise and fight for her. His eyes, once winter seas, now held the warmth of summer. "I am willing," she said, and for the first time in years when she smiled, it reached every corner of her soul. They turned back toward the castle, its windows glowing with lamplight. Behind them, the garden gate swung shut with a soft, final click. Ahead of them lay a future that had been hard-won, marked by scars, but finally beautifully shared. Evangeline tightened her fingers around his and did not let go. The silent waiting was over. The healing had begun. And in the quiet of that autumn evening, two hearts once so far apart finally found their way home.